Good morning. I have not missed wearing a mask. Not a bit. It's good to be with you this morning. Yeah, so I'm a little under the weather. I apologize for my voice. I'm going to preach this morning because I knew that this is a very special Sunday and I wanted to share this message with you, and then I'm going to get out of here. But I want to say welcome again to all the visitors. Welcome to those of you who are visiting for the first time. We're so thankful that you are here. Glad you are at Grace this morning. Welcome, Anthony. We are so thankful to have you here, and thank you for being such a wonderful servant for really a wonderful institution in our state and our United Methodist College in Alabama. We're grateful for you, for your witness, and for all you're doing at Huntingdon, and so glad that you are captaining the ship now down in Montgomery. So I want to say, for those of you who are here for the first time in this sermon series, we are in week 3 of a 3-week series. We have been talking about financial stewardship through the story in Exodus 16 of God providing manna for the Israelites. So if you haven't been here for the past couple weeks, I want to just get you caught up real quickly on where we are in this story. So what has happened is, this is the part in the Bible where the Israelites, or the Hebrew people, have been slaves in Egypt now for generations. And they have been under the thumb of Pharaoh, and they have cried out to God. God has heard their cries. God has sent Moses, an unlikely leader, to come down and to rescue those people, to guide them out of Pharaoh's grasp, across the Red Sea, into the wilderness, where they are now in a 40-year transitional period, learning about what it means to be people who are no longer enslaved. Sometimes we remember that it takes years or generations, lifetimes even, for cycles to be broken that have been oppressive or difficult for people for so long. And so in this 40-year period, which, look, if you look at a map of the Sinai Peninsula, it's not going to take anybody 40 years to get out of there. It's a confusing place. It's a huge place, but it's not a 40-year walk to get to the Promised Land. That's why we know that in this period, there is something else going on here. There's something that is supposed to be a reminding the people that they are no longer people subject to Pharaoh, but they are God's people. And they are going to learn new rules, new traditions and customs, new practices around faith and their beliefs. They're going to learn ethics. They're going to learn responsibility. They're going to learn care for their neighbor. And all of these lessons are going to be essential because they are going to help this people be identified as a nation that is set apart, blessed to be a blessing, and to take that into this new land which they will soon inherit. But before they're ready for that, they have to go through this challenging 40-year period in the wilderness. And so the first lesson that they get when they get there, and this is where we spent our time in the sermon last week, we talked about how the first lesson is, interestingly, a stewardship lesson. As Amanda pointed out and reminded the kids and all of us, when the Israelites woke up in the morning, they saw that there was this flaky white substance on the ground that the people called manna. It served as a daily ration of bread for everyone. There was just enough to be full for everybody to get all that they needed, and nothing left over, except on the night before the Sabbath, when there was enough left over to carry them into the next day. So there would be enough that they wouldn't have to work, they wouldn't have to gather anything on the harvest. It could be a true day of rest and rejuvenation and connection to God. And during that rest time, they had the day before's bread. That was enough. And then there was God's portion that was set aside and put into the special jar and kept there for generations. Even once the temple would be built, that jar contained God's portion of the manna too. So there was the spending or the eating, there was the saving portion, and then there was the giving portion. Just like so many of us teach our children about allowance and how to do their own financial management. So that's where we are in the story, but I want to point out to you that even before there was the blessing of the food and the manna, there was the greater, overarching blessing. And that is that ultimately, this story in Exodus 16 is about God's love for God's people. And I want to talk a lot more about that this morning. But I also want to give a little bit of context, because I think that this message sort of hits home or hits harder if we understand all that's going on here in the background. Remember that at this time, in the ancient Near East, and perhaps throughout the entire world at this point in time, there was an understanding of people's relationships with the gods and goddesses. And that relationship functioned in this kind of a way. The gods needed to be pleased. And if the gods were happy with the people, then the people flourished. They thrived. If the gods were unhappy, things were very difficult. It's a very primitive and kind of a black and white way of understanding things and looking at the world. But the idea was, hey, if it's sunny and beautiful and our crops are growing, then everything's great and the gods must be pleased, so we should continue to do what we've been doing. But if the sun stays out too long for too many weeks and scorches up the earth and dries up our plants, then the gods must be angry. But if there's a little bit of rain, then the gods must be happy again. But if it's too much rain, then it floods everything and washes away our communities, and then the gods must be angry again. And so it's very much this kind of transactional understanding of the gods and the goddesses. This is what was taking place throughout the ancient Near East, and it has been what has been taking place in the land of Egypt long before even the story of the Hebrew people's enslavement there. The Egyptians have more gods and goddesses than most people can keep track of, but they function in the same way. There's a sky god, there's a sun god, there's a river god, there's an earth god, there's a god of life, there's a god of death, there's a god of heaven, there's a god of the underworld. There's all kinds of gods and goddesses, and we must please them, and we must do the things that they like so that this relationship can keep going in a healthy and fruitful way. But it was always living in this fear, this tension of what if we make God angry? And what kind of havoc will the gods wreak upon our lives if we step out of line? So that transactional way of thinking was very much a part of Egyptian culture. And I would venture to guess it became ingrained in the Hebrew people. No matter how much they wanted to be set apart, and no matter how much at this point in the story that they knew that they were descendants of Abraham and Sarah and people of the covenant, the fact of the matter is that when you are enslaved, it is a difficult existence, and you are going to do everything that you can to survive. And in your desperation, you might even turn at times to some of the gods and the goddesses that are foreign to you, because that's what you are being told brings about a better life. And so the Hebrew people, even if they didn't fully adopt this idea, it was a part of the culture that they were living in. And they were struggling with this. And so their identity needed to be remade in a new way in this 40-year period. Not only that, but it was a brutal existence for the slaves. They were kept alive only so long as they could be useful to Pharaoh. They were fed not because their survival was ensured or desired per se, but so that they could provide the labor. They could provide the services that the Egyptians, particularly the higher-ups, needed to follow. And the Pharaoh himself was regarded to be a god in human flesh. So the idea of pleasing the gods and living only so that you could do things that would curry favor for that god, or that you could provide things that were useful to that god, was very much a part of their community, their culture, and their daily rhythms of life. Many years ago, in fact, last century, Elie Wiesel wrote in his memoir, Night, about his time in his youth living in a concentration camp during World War II. And he talked about how he and each one of the prisoners would receive a meager ration of bread. You see, the Nazis, in their cruelty, had figured out that just the smallest amount of bread, if served in a particular quantity, would be just enough to keep the prisoners alive. Just enough to be useful to them. Because obviously we know that exterminating them was not something that they hesitated to do. But if they fed them just enough to keep them alive, that was what they did. Wiesel talks about measuring days with his stomach. getting lost in time, but only knowing that he was alive because he was eating again that day. Take this kind of example, and take, for example, what was happening to the enslaved Hebrew peoples in Egypt. And contrast that now with what they experience in Exodus 16. They go into the wilderness. They're only there for a short period of time. They have quail, as Anthony read in the scripture this morning, quail every night that fill the ground so they could get their fill of meat. And in the morning when they woke up, they found on the ground in front of their tents, like the morning dew or frost on the grass, this flaky substance that they could gather up called manna, and they would eat it. And it would be enough. Not enough to keep them alive, but enough for them to get their fill. And why was it given? So that they could prove their usefulness? So that they could serve with their hard labor a God who demanded it? No. The most important lesson in the 16th chapter of Exodus, the first time that God interacts with this community in this powerful way after they have been delivered out of the hand of Pharaoh, is with a message that is not about the bread. It's about the gift that precedes the bread. The message, the impetus behind the bread, which is love. God provided not because of anything that the Israelites promised to do for him, but because of God's love. God says, I love them so much, I am going to make sure that they survive. Not only that, but in time, they will be thriving. They will not have enough just to stay alive, but they will have enough to be filled. They will have enough that I will set aside some for them to have some on their day of rest. They will have enough that they will continue to grow in number, that they will build a community, that they will understand that they have a different kind of culture, that they are set apart from other groups, that their God is different than the other gods, that demands obedience, that demands sacrifice, that demands hard labor, that are kept alive only as long as they are useful to the gods. That is not the God who I am. I am going to give simply because I love them. No other reason. And what a gift it is for us to still be a part of that tradition, that we do not exist today as long as we provide usefulness to God. We are here today because our God loves us so much that our God created out of an abundance of that love, a desire to share that love with us. And we also now have our traditions, our culture, our community, our ethics, our religious practices, our beliefs. Why? Because God shows us that it is the better way. It is the way that leads to fulfillment and joy in life. But it is not because God is eager to prove something to us or demands that we prove our usefulness to God. The gift was never actually about the bread. The gift was about the love behind the gift. It's like putting the best thing before the bread, putting the best part before the meal. It's like having desserts for lunch today. If we think about our tradition and where this sort of plays out longer term in the scope of the Christian story, we see the same thing happening in communion. When we gather at the communion table or when Jesus breaks bread with his disciples, I don't get the sense that the idea was, make sure you get full, guys. It's about the gift behind it. It's about the symbolism of it. I am giving you this bread to live on. This is the most important stuff. This is the ultimate point of the message. It's not about the wafer. It's not about the crouton. It's about the act and the love and the spirit behind the gift. In just a few moments, We're going to invite you to come down and to share your gifts of your tithes and offering this morning. And also for those of you who have taken the opportunity to prayerfully fill out your estimate of giving card or your commitment card for 2025. We do this, and I want to be very clear about this. We receive these gifts every Sunday, and we fill out these cards once a year in the fall. Yes, they're for planning purposes. Yes, they're to help with our finance team and our budgeting process. But let's be clear, this is about a spiritual act. This is about an opportunity for you to have a conversation with God about what you want to give. Not because it's demanded of you, not because this hopefully erases some sort of guilt that you're carrying, although I don't want that, but this is not a guilt eraser. This is not to demonstrate your usefulness to the church, to Christ, to God the Father. This is about an opportunity for you to say, I have received the ultimate gift of love that you have offered. And this is one of the ways I want to respond. Any worshipful act should not be done out of guilt or out of shame or out of resentment. But when we offer our songs of praise, when we offer our prayers in worship, when we share our financial gifts, when we serve our neighbors, these are a response to the greatest gift that we have already received. The gift with no strings attached that said, you are mine, you are my beloved, and this I share with you. It's yours, freely given, no matter what. This is simply another way of responding to that. So as we look back and we count the ways that God has been so wonderful in offering so many gifts of blessings along the way, the biblical story alone recounts the gift of love present at creation, the gift of love present in the sharing of the manna, the gift of love that was offered in the incarnation of the Word made flesh in Jesus Christ, the gift of that teaching and that servanthood and that loving legacy that Jesus shared and passed on to his disciples, the gift of love present at the resurrection and the empty tomb, the gift of love in the early church, the gift of love made known to us in the promise of salvation. These are the gifts among so many others that God freely gives. And this, as we come forward to share our gifts, is one of the ways that we lovingly and faithfully respond. Will you pray with me?